Good afternoon, everyone. Keith, Jess. This is obviously my part of the discussion, so I'll get straight into it. So what I'm talking about is why I'm on the affirmative side of the discussion, that racism and discrimination is a part of Australian sport and is embedded in Australian sporting culture. So with my part of the debate, I thought it was important to look at certain types and certain aspects of racism, and the most influential, or the one that is, I guess you could say, fits this statement the most, is structural racism. Structural racism is aspects of societal, political, economic, social norms in which racial practices are embedded in those. Often when structural racism occurs, it's not to the fault of the people, it's more so just because it's a norm or because it just happens. So the first example that I wanted to give when talking about this statement and talking about structural racism is the Anthony Mundine example. So from a Sky News report on 2016, Anthony Mundine called for all Indigenous and coloured athletes to kneel during the anthem and reject the Australian flag. Mundine's idea behind this was that the anthem and the flag is still a representation of white settlement within Australia, and it still is quite a large, I guess you could say, promoter of white Australia and the former white Australian policy. The comments obviously were received both positively and negatively, with a number of Indigenous athletes across all football codes, agreeing, speaking out, also disagreeing with Mundine's statements. In a study done by Salter, she discusses that Australia has an extreme difficulty with progressing from the notion of white settlement, and that white settlement is still embedded within our culture, which makes it difficult for the Aboriginal community to be respected and to gain proper rights, I guess you could say, within the community. There's also another study by Zersh, who surveyed a number of individuals, Aboriginal individuals from urban areas. With that, she found that 93% of those Indigenous people who were surveyed could identify with some form of racism occurring within their day-to-day life throughout the duration of their life. So in saying that and using these two examples, it's evident to see how structural racism has become embedded within society, and that's now reflecting on sport with a multinational sportsman, I guess you could say, like Anthony Mundine, coming out and speaking against the discrimination of his people and the Indigenous community. The second example that I wanted to give, which is also my final example, is the Nicky Winmar incident. So for those of you who don't know, Nicky Winmar was an AFL or also VFL player who is obviously of Indigenous heritage, who was from Western Australia. Nicky Winmar was one of the most decorated Indigenous athletes to ever play Australian rules football. He was the first Indigenous athlete to play 200 plus games. So obviously you can see he's quite the figure when it comes to the Indigenous community. During a game in, I believe it was September 1993, Winmar actually received abuse from Collingwood supporters while he was playing for St Kilda. After kicking a goal, Winmar stood up, lifted up his shirt and pointed to his skin, to symbolise his colour and how he was proud and black. In an interview done by Michael Gordon from The Age, and another interview done by the program, I believe it was on ABC, Living Black, sorry. Winmar on both occasions declined to repeat what was said. However, he did indicate that his response was extremely justified, and the vilification in which he received was quite severe, and severe enough for people to understand and accept what he had done. So as you can see, again, it's structural racism that's been embedded in society. It's a social norm. This obviously has resulted in some sort of abuse for this, decorated athlete, this person who should be extremely well respected, who should be, viewed as almost a hero to not only his people but to the whole community, breaking those barriers and leaving home and being an athlete who could finally do his thing and make his people proud. In saying that, there was a study completed or a paper written, I should say, by the Australian government. In that paper, it's one of the Indigenous welfare communities, and in that paper they begin to state how sport can be or should be the catalyst for developing social norms, not only through mannerisms and things like that, but when it comes to ethnic and racial norms. So in saying that racism isn't embedded in sport, after seeing these examples, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. You can see two decorated athletes, both Indigenous, who have both received immense amounts of vilification, immense amount of discrimination and racism, to the extent where they need to stand up. So I think it's up to the Australian community and it's up to the Australian public to create those new norms and to kick racism and allow sport to be the catalyst for something greater, for the greater good, to allow people to all get along and to, I guess you could say, unite a generation. So I hope I've convinced you enough to see and to understand how racism and discrimination is still a large, major contributing factor within Australian sport and the Australian community.